He has just vanished, he said. I'm sure he went back to Arizona or to Texas where he has business. I took a chance and went to see Lucas Coronado by myself. I arrived at his house at midday. Couldn't find him either. I asked his neighbors if they knew where he might be. They looked at me belligerently and didn't dignify me with an answer. I left, but went by his house again in the late afternoon. I didn't expect anything at all. In fact, I was prepared to leave for Los Angeles immediately. To my surprise, Lucas Coronado was not only there, but was extremely friendly to me. He frankly expressed his approval on seeing that I'd come without Jorge Campos, who he said was an outright pain in the ass. He complained that Jorge Campos, to whom he referred as a renegade Yaqui Indian, took delight in exploiting his fellow Yaquis. I gave Lucas Coronado some gifts that I brought him and bought from him: 3 masks, an exquisitely carved staff, and a pair of rattling leggings made out of the cocoons of some insects from the desert, leggings which the Yaquis used in their traditional dances. Then I took him to Guaymas for dinner. I saw him every day for the 5 days that I remained in the area, and he gave me endless amounts of information about the Yaquis, their history and social organization, and the meaning and nature of their festivities. I was having such fun as a field worker that I even felt reluctant to ask him if he knew anything about the old shaman. Overcoming second thought, I finally asked Lucas Coronado if he knew the old man whom Jorge Campos had assured me was such a prominent shaman. Lucas Coronado seemed perplexed. He assured me that, to his knowledge, no such man had ever existed in that part of the country, and that Jorge Campos was a crook who only wanted to cheat me out of my money. Hearing Lucas Coronado deny the existence of that old man had a terrible, unexpected impact on me. In one instant, it became evident to me that I really didn't give a damn about fieldwork. I only cared about finding that old man. I knew then that meeting the old shaman had indeed been the culmination of something that had nothing to do with my desires, aspirations, or even thoughts as an anthropologist. I wondered more than ever who in the hell that old man was. Without any inhibitory checks, I began to whine and yell in frustration. I stomped on the floor. Lucas Coronado was quite taken aback by my display. He looked at me, bewildered, and then started to laugh. I had no idea that he could laugh. I apologized to him for my outburst of anger and frustration. I couldn't explain why I was so out of sorts. Lucas Coronado seemed to understand my quandary. Things like that happen in this area, he said. I had no idea to what he was referring, nor did I want to ask him. I was deadly afraid of the easiness with which he took offense. The peculiarity of the Yaquis was the facility they had to feel offended. They seemed to be perennially on their toes, looking out for insults that were too subtle to be noticed by anyone else. There are magical beings living in the mountains around here, he continued. They can act on people. They make people go veritably mad. People rant and rave under their influence. And when they finally calm down, exhausted, they don't have any clue as to why they exploded. Do you think that's what's happened to me? Definitely, he replied with total conviction. You already have a predisposition to going bonkers at the drop of a hat, but you're also very contained. Today, you weren't contained. You went bananas over nothing. It isn't over nothing, sure. I didn't know it until now, but to me, that old man is the driving force of all my efforts. Lucas Coronado kept quiet, as if in deep thought. Then he began to pace up and down. Do you know any old man who lives around here but isn't quite from this area? I asked him. He didn't understand my question. I had to explain to him that the old Indian I'd met was perhaps like Jorge Campos, a Yaqui who had lived somewhere else. Lucas Coronado explained that the surname Matus was quite common in that area, but that he didn't know any Matus whose first name was Juan. He seemed despondent. Then he had a moment of insight and stated that because the man was old, he might have another name, and that perhaps he had given me a working name, not his real one. "The only old man I know," he went on, "is Ignacio Flores' father. He comes to see his son from time to time, but he comes from Mexico City. Come to think of it, he's Ignacio's father, but he doesn't seem that old. But he's old. Ignacio's old, too. His father seems younger, though." He laughed heartily at his realization. Apparently, he'd never thought about the youth of the old man until that moment. He kept on shaking his head as if in disbelief. I, on the other hand, was elated beyond measure. "That's the man!" I yelled, without knowing why. Lucas Coronado didn't know where Ignacio Flores actually lived, but he was very accommodating and directed me to drive to a nearby Yaqui town, where he found the man for me. Ignacio Flores was a big, corpulent man, perhaps in his mid-60s. Lucas Coronado had warned me that the big man had been a career soldier in his youth and that he still had the bearing of a military man. Ignacio Flores had an enormous mustache. That and the fierceness of his eyes made him, for me, the personification of a ferocious soldier. He had a dark complexion. His hair was still jet black in spite of his years. His forceful, gravelly voice seemed to be trained solely to give commands. I had the impression that he had been a cavalryman. He walked as if he were still wearing spurs, and for some strange reason, impossible to fathom, I heard the sound of spurs when he walked. Lucas Coronado introduced me to him and said that I had come from Arizona to see his father, whom I'd met in Nogales. Ignacio Flores didn't seem surprised at all.
"Oh, yes," he said. "My father travels a great deal."
Without any other preliminaries, he directed us to where we could find his father. He didn't come with us, I thought, out of politeness. He excused himself and marched away as if he were keeping step in a parade. I prepared myself to go to the old man's house with Lucas Coronado. Instead, he politely declined. He wanted me to drive him back to his house. "I think you found the man you were looking for, and I feel that you should be alone," he said. I marveled at how extraordinarily polite these Yaqui Indians were, and yet at the same time so fierce. I'd been told that the Yaquis were savages who had no qualms about killing anyone. As far as I was concerned, though, their most remarkable feature was their politeness and consideration. I drove to the house of Ignacio Flores' father. There, I found the man I was looking for. "I wonder why Jorge Campos lied and told me that he knew you," I said at the end of my account. "He didn't lie to you," Don Juan said, with the conviction of someone who was condoning Jorge Campos' behavior. "He didn't even misrepresent himself. He thought you were an easy mark and was going to cheat you. He couldn't carry out his plan, though, because infinity overpowered him. Do you know that he disappeared soon after he met you, never to be found? Jorge Campos was a most meaningful personage for you," he continued. "You will find in whatever transpired between the two of you a sort of guiding blueprint, because he is the representation of your life." "Why? I'm not a crook," I protested. He laughed, as if he knew something that I didn't. The next thing I knew, I found myself in the midst of an extensive explanation of my actions, my ideals, my expectations. However, a strange thought urged me to consider with the same fervor with which I was explaining myself that under certain circumstances, I might be like Jorge Campos. I found the thought inadmissible, and I used all my available energy to try to disprove it. However, down in the depths of myself, I didn't care to apologize if I were like Jorge Campos. When I voiced my dilemma, Don Juan laughed so hard that he choked many times.
If I were you,
He commented.
I'd listen to my inner voice. What difference would it make if you were like Jorge Campos, a crook? He was a cheap crook. You are more elaborate. This is the power of the recounting. This is why sorcerers use it. It puts you into contact with something that you didn't even suspect existed in you.
I wanted to leave right then. Don Juan knew exactly how I felt.
Don't listen to the superficial voice that makes you angry,
He said, commanding.
Listen to that deeper voice that is going to guide you from now on. The voice that is laughing. Listen to it and laugh with it. Laugh! Laugh!
His words were like a hypnotic command to me. Against my will, I began to laugh. Never had I been so happy. I felt free, unmasked.
Recount to yourself the story of Jorge Campos over and over,
Don Juan said.
You will find endless wealth in it. Every detail is part of a map. It is the nature of infinity once we cross a certain threshold to put a blueprint in front of us.
He peered at me for a long time. He didn't merely glance as before, but he gazed intently at me.
One deed which Jorge Campos couldn't avoid performing, he finally said, was to put you in contact with the other man, Lucas Coronado, who is as meaningful to you as Jorge Campos himself. Maybe even more so.
In the course of recounting the story of those two men, I'd realized that I'd spent more time with Lucas Coronado than with Jorge Campos. However, our exchanges hadn't been as intense and were marked by enormous lagoons of silence. Lucas Coronado was not by nature a talkative man, and by some strange twist, whenever he was silent, he managed to drag me with him into that state.
Lucas Coronado is the other part of your map,
Don Juan said.
Don't you find it strange that he is a sculptor like yourself, a super-sensitive artist who was, like yourself at one time, in search of a sponsor for his art? He looked for a sponsor just like you looked for a woman, a lover of the arts who would sponsor your creativity.
I entered into another terrifying struggle. This time, my struggle was between my absolute certainty that I hadn't mentioned this aspect of my life to him, the fact that all of it was true, and the fact that I was unable to find an explanation for how he could have obtained this information. Again, I wanted to leave right away, but once more, the impulse was overpowered by a voice that came from a deep place. Without any coaxing, I began to laugh heartily. Some part of me, at a profound level, didn't give a hoot about finding out how Don Juan had gotten that information. The fact that he had it and had displayed it in such a delicate but conniving manner was a delightful maneuver to witness. It was of no consequence that the superficial part of me got angry and wanted to leave.
Very good,
Don Juan said to me, patting me forcefully on the back.
Very good.
He was pensive for a moment, as if he were perhaps seeing things invisible to the average eye.
Jorge Campos and Lucas Coronado are the two ends of an axis, he said. That axis is you. At one end, a ruthless, shameless, crass mercenary who takes care of himself. Hideous, but indestructible. At the other end, a super-sensitive, tormented artist, weak and vulnerable. That should have been the map of your life, were it not for the appearance of another possibility, the one that opened up when you crossed the threshold of infinity. You searched for me, and you found me. And so, you did cross the threshold. The intent of infinity told me to look for someone like you. I found you, thus crossing the threshold myself.
The conversation ended at that point. Don Juan went into one of his habitual long periods of total silence. It was only at the end of the day, when we'd returned to his house, and while we were sitting under his ramada cooling off from the long hike we had taken, that he broke his silence.
In your recounting of what happened between you and Jorge Campos, and you and Lucas Coronado, Don Juan went on, I found, and I hope you did too, a very disturbing factor. For me, it's an omen. It points to the end of an era, meaning that whatever was standing there cannot remain. Very flimsy elements brought you to me. None of them could stand on their own. This is what I drew from your recounting.
I remembered that Don Juan had revealed to me one day that Lucas Coronado was terminally ill. He had some health condition that was slowly consuming him.
I have sent word to him through my son Ignacio about what he should do to cure himself,
Don Juan went on.
But he thinks it's nonsense and doesn't want to hear it. It isn't Lucas's fault. The entire human race doesn't want to hear anything. They hear only what they want to hear.
I remembered that I had prevailed upon Don Juan to tell me what I could say to Lucas Coronado to help him alleviate his physical pain and mental anguish. Don Juan not only told me what to tell him, but asserted that if Lucas Coronado wanted to, he could easily cure himself. Nevertheless, when I delivered Don Juan's message, Lucas Coronado looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. Then he shifted into a brilliant and, had I been a Yaqui, deeply insulting portrayal of a man who is bored to death by someone's unwarranted insistence. I thought that only a Yaqui Indian could be so subtle. "Those things don't help me," he finally said defiantly, angered by my lack of sensibility. "It doesn't really matter. We all have to die. Don't you dare believe that I've lost hope. I'm going to get some money from the government bank. I'll get an advance on my crops, and then I'll get enough money to buy something that will cure me, ipso facto. Its name is Vitaminol." "What is Vitaminol?" I'd asked. "It's something that's advertised on the radio," he said, with the innocence of a child. "It cures everything. It's recommended for people who don't eat meat or fish or fowl every day. It's recommended for people like myself, who can barely keep body and soul together." In my eagerness to help Lucas Coronado, I committed right then the biggest blunder imaginable in a society of such hypersensitive beings as the Yaquis. I offered to give him the money to buy Vitaminol. His cold stare was the measure of how deeply I had hurt him. My stupidity was unforgivable. Very softly, Lucas Coronado said that he was capable of affording Vitaminol himself. I went back to Don Juan's house. I felt like weeping. My eagerness had betrayed me.
"Don't waste your energy worrying about things like that,"
Don Juan said coldly.
"Lucas Coronado is locked in a vicious cycle. But so are you. So is everyone. He has Vitaminol, which he trusts will cure everything and resolve every one of his problems. At the moment, he can't afford it, but he has great hopes that he eventually will be able to."
Don Juan peered at me with his piercing eye.
"I told you that Lucas Coronado's acts are the map of your life," he said. "Believe you me, they are. Lucas Coronado pointed out Vitaminol to you, and he did it so powerfully and painfully that he hurt you and he made you weep."
Don Juan stopped talking then. It was a long, most effective pause.
"And don't tell me that you don't understand what I mean," he said. "One way or another, we all have our own version of Vitaminol."
Who was Juan Matus, really? The part of my account of meeting Don Juan that he didn't want to hear about was my feelings and impressions on that fateful day when I walked into his house. The contradictory clash between my expectations and the reality of the situation and the effect that was caused in me by a cluster of the most extravagant ideas I had ever heard.
That is more in the line of confession than in the line of events,
he'd said to me once when I tried to tell him about all this. You couldn't be more wrong, Don Juan, I began, but I stopped. Something in the way he looked at me made me realize that he was right. Whatever I was going to say could have sounded only like lip service, flattery. What had taken place in our first real meeting, however, was of transcendental importance to me, an event of ultimate consequence. During my first encounter with Don Juan, in the bus depot in Nogales, Arizona, something of an unusual nature had happened, but it had come to me cushioned in my concerns with the presentation of self. I had wanted to impress Don Juan, and in attempting to do so, I had focused all my attention on the act of selling my wares, so to speak. It was only months later that a strange residue of forgotten events began to appear. One day, out of nowhere, and with no coaxing or coaching on my part, I recollected with extraordinary clarity something that had completely bypassed me during my actual encounter with him. When he'd stopped me from telling him my name, he had peered into my eyes and had numbed me with his look. There was infinitely more that I could have said to him about myself. I could have expounded on my knowledge and worth for hours if his look hadn't completely cut me off. In light of this new realization, I reconsidered everything that had happened to me on that occasion. My unavoidable conclusion was that I had experienced the interruption of some mysterious flow that kept me going. A flow that had never been interrupted before, at least not in the manner in which Don Juan had done. When I tried to describe to any of my friends what I'd physically experienced, a strange perspiration began to cover my entire body, the same perspiration that I'd experienced when Don Juan had given me that look. I had been, at that moment, not only incapable of voicing a single word, but incapable of having a single thought. For some time after, I dwelled on the physical sensation of this interruption, for which I found no rational explanation. I argued for a while that Don Juan must have hypnotized me. But then my memory told me that he hadn't given any hypnotic command, nor had he made any movements that could have trapped my attention. In fact, he had merely glanced at me. It was the intensity of that glance that had made it appear as if he had stared at me for a long time. It had obsessed me and had rendered me discombobulated at a deep physical level. When I finally had Don Juan in front of me, the first thing I noticed about him was that he didn't look at all as I had imagined him during all the time I had tried to find him. I had fabricated an image of the man I'd met at the bus depot, which I perfected every day by, allegedly, remembering more detail. In my mind, he was an old man, still very strong and nimble, yet almost frail. The man facing me was muscular and decisive. He moved with agility, but not nimbleness. His steps were firm and at the same time light. He exuded vitality and purpose. My composite memory was not at all in harmony with the real thing. I thought he had short white hair and an extremely dark complexion. His hair was longer and not as white as I'd imagined. His complexion was not that dark either. I could have sworn that his features were bird-like because of his age, but that was not so either. His face was full, almost round. In one glance, the most outstanding feature of the man looking at me was his dark eyes, which shone with a peculiar, dancing glow. Something that had bypassed me completely in my prior assessment of him was the fact that his total countenance was that of an athlete. His shoulders were broad, his stomach flat. He seemed to be planted firmly on the ground, There was no feebleness to his knees, no tremor in his upper limbs. I had imagined detecting a slight tremor in his head and arms as if he were nervous and unsteady. I had also imagined him to be about 5 feet 6 inches tall, 3 inches shorter than his actual height. Don Juan didn't seem surprised to see me. I wanted to tell him how difficult it had been for me to find him. I would have liked to be congratulated by him on my titanic efforts, but he just laughed at me, teasing me. "Your efforts are not important," he said. "What's important is that you found my place. Sit down, he said, enticing me, pointing to one of the freight boxes under his Ramada and patting me on my back. But it wasn't a friendly pat. It felt like he had slapped me on the back, although he never actually touched me. His quasi-slap created a strange, unstable sensation, which appeared abruptly and disappeared before I had time to grasp what it was. What was left in me instead was a strange peace. I felt at ease. My mind was crystal clear. I had no expectations, no desires. My usual nervousness and sweaty hands, the marks of my existence, were suddenly gone. "Now you will understand everything I am going to say to you," Don Juan said to me, looking into my eyes as he had done in the bus depot. Ordinarily, I would have found his statement perfunctory, perhaps rhetorical, but when he said it, I could only assure him, repeatedly and sincerely, that I would understand anything he said to me. He looked me in the eyes again with a ferocious intensity. "I am Juan Marcos," he said, sitting down on another freight box, a few feet away, facing me. "This is my name, and I voice it because with it, I am making a bridge for you to cross over to where I am." He stared at me for an instant before he started talking again. "I am a sorcerer," he went on. "I belong to a lineage of sorcerers that has lasted for 27 generations. I am the Nagual of my generation." He explained to me that the leader of a party of sorcerers like himself was called the Nagual, and that this was a generic term applied to a sorcerer in each generation who had some specific energetic configuration that set him apart from the others, not in terms of superiority or inferiority or anything of the like, but in terms of the capacity to be responsible. "Only the Nagual," he said, "has the energetic capacity to be responsible for the fate of his cohort. Every one of his cohorts knows this, and they exceed. The Nagual can be a man or a woman. In the time of the sorcerers who were founders of my lineage, women were by rule the Naguals. Their natural pragmatism, the product of their femaleness, led my lineage into pits of practicalities from which they could barely emerge. Then, the males took over and led my lineage into pits of imbecility from which we are barely emerging now. Since the time of the Nagual Lujan, who lived about 200 years ago," he went on, "there has been a joint nexus of effort shared by a man and a woman. The Nagual man brings sobriety, the Nagual woman brings innovation." I wanted to ask him at this point if there was a woman in his life who was the Nagual, but the depth of my concentration didn't allow me to formulate the question. Instead, he himself formulated it for me. "Is there a Nagual woman in my life?" he asked. "No, there isn't any. I am a solitary sorcerer. I have my cohorts, though. At the moment, they're not around." A thought came with uncontainable vigor into my mind. At that instant, I remembered what some people in Yuma had told me about Don Juan running with a party of Mexican men who seemed to be very versed in sorcery maneuvers. "To be a sorcerer," Don Juan continued, "doesn't mean to practice witchcraft, or to work to affect people, or to be possessed by demons. To be a sorcerer
means to reach a level of awareness that makes inconceivable things available. The term sorcery is inadequate to express what sorcerers do, and so is the term shamanism. The actions of sorcerers are exclusively in the realm of the abstract, the impersonal. Sorcerers struggle to reach a goal that has nothing to do with the quests of an average man. Sorcerers' aspirations are to reach infinity, to be conscious of it.
Don Juan continued, saying that the task of sorcerers was to face infinity, and that they plunged into it daily, as a fisherman plunges into the sea. It was such an overwhelming task that sorcerers had to state their names before venturing into it. He reminded me that in Nogales he had stated his name before any interaction had taken place between us. He had, in this manner, asserted his individuality in front of the infinite. I understood with unequaled clarity what he was explaining. I didn't have to ask him for clarification. My keenness of thought should have surprised me, but it didn't at all. I knew at that moment that I had always been crystal clear, merely playing dumb for someone else's benefit.
Without you knowing anything about it, he continued, I started you on the traditional quest. You are the man I'm thinking of. My quest ended when I found you. Yours, when you found me now.
Don Juan explained to me that, as the Nagual of his generation, he was in search of an individual who had a specific energetic configuration, adequate to ensure the continuity of his lineage. He said that at a given moment, the Nagual of each generation, for 27 successive generations, had entered into the most nerve-wracking experience of their lives, the search for succession. Looking me straight in the eyes, he stated that what made human beings into sorcerers was their capacity to perceive energy directly as it flows in the universe, and that when sorcerers perceive a human being in this fashion, they see a luminous ball or a luminous egg-shaped figure. His contention was that human beings are not only capable of seeing energy directly as it flows in the universe, but that they actually do see it, although they're not deliberately conscious of seeing. He made right then the most crucial distinction for sorcery, the one between the general state of being aware and the particular state of being deliberately conscious of something. He categorized all human beings as possessing awareness in a general sense, which permits them to see energy directly, and he categorized sorcerers as the only human beings who were deliberately conscious of seeing energy directly. He then defined awareness as energy, and energy as constant flux, a luminous vibration that was never stationary, but always moving of its own accord. He asserted that when a human being was seen, he was perceived as a conglomerate of energy fields held together by the most mysterious force in the universe, a binding, agglutinating, vibratory force that holds energy fields together in a cohesive unit. He further explained that the Nagual was a specific sorcerer in each generation, whom the other sorcerers were able to see not as a single luminous ball, but as a set of two spheres of luminosity fused, one over the other. This feature of doubleness, he continued, permits the Nagual to perform maneuvers that are rather difficult for an average sorcerer. For example, the Nagual is a connoisseur of the force that holds us together as a cohesive unit. The Nagual could place his full attention for a fraction of a second on that force and numb the other. I did that to you with the busting gun, because I wanted to stop your barrage of me. I wanted you to find and cut the crap the sorcerers of my lineage maintain, Don Juan, that the presence of a double being, a Nagual, is sufficient to clarify things for us. What's odd about it is that the presence of the Nagual clarifies things in a veiled fashion. It happened to me when I met the Nagual Julian, my teacher. His
presence baffled me for years, because every time I was around him I could think clearly, but when he moved away, I became the same idiot that I had always been. I had the privilege, Don Juan went on, of actually meeting and dealing with two Nagual. For 6 years, at the request of the Nagual Elias, the teacher of the Nagual Julian, I went to live with him. He is the one who reared me, so to speak. It was a rare privilege. I had a ringside seat for watching what a Nagual really is. The Nagual Elias and the Nagual Julian were two men of tremendously different temperaments. The Nagual Elias was quiet, lost in the darkness of his sight. The Nagual Julian was bombastic, with compulsive talk. It seemed that he lived to dazzle women. There were more women in his life than one would care to think about. Yet both of them were astoundingly alike, in that there was nothing inside them. They were empty. The Nagual Elias was a collection of astounding, haunting stories of regions unknown. The Nagual Julian was a collection of stories that would have anybody in stitches sprawled on the ground laughing. Whenever I tried to pin down the man, the real man, the way I could pinpoint the man in my father, the man in everybody I knew, I found nothing. Instead of a real person inside me, there was a bunch of stories about persons unknown. Each of the two men had his own flair. But the end result was just the same. Emptiness. An emptiness that reflected not the world, but infinity.
Don Juan went on explaining that the moment one crosses a peculiar threshold in infinity, either deliberately or, as in my case, unwittingly, everything that happens to one from then on is no longer exclusively in one's own domain, but enters into the realm of infinity. When we met in Arizona, both of us crossed a peculiar threshold, he continued. And this threshold was not decided by either one of us, but by infinity itself. Infinity is everything that surrounds us. He said this and made a broad gesture with his arms. The sorcerers of my lineage call it infinity, the spirit, the dark sea of awareness, and say that it is something that exists out there and rules our lives. I was truly capable of comprehending everything he was saying, and yet I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I asked if crossing the threshold had been an accidental event, born of unpredictable circumstances, ruled by chance. He answered that his steps and mine were guided by infinity, and that circumstances that seemed to be ruled by chance were in essence ruled by the active side of infinity. He called it intent. What put you and me together, he went on, was the intent of infinity. It's impossible to determine what this intent of infinity is, yet it is there, as palpable as you and I are. Sorcerers say that it is a tremor in the air. The advantage of sorcerers is to know that a tremor in the air exists and to acquiesce to it without any further ado. For sorcerers, there's no pondering, wondering, or speculating. They know that all they have is the possibility of merging with the intent of infinity, and they just do. Nothing could have been clearer to me than those statements. As far as I was concerned, the truth of what he was telling me was so self-evident that it didn't permit me to ponder how such absurd assertions could have sounded so rational. I knew that everything that Don Juan was saying was not only truism, but I could corroborate by referring to my own being. I knew about everything he was saying. I had the sensation that I had lived every twist of his description. Our interchange ended then. Something seemed to deflate inside me. It was at that instant that the thought crossed my mind that I was losing my mind. I I'd been blinded by weird statements, and I'd lost every conceivable sense of objectivity. Accordingly, I left Don Juan's house in a real hurry, feeling threatened to the core by an unseen enemy. Don Juan walked me to my car, fully cognizant of what was going on inside me.
"Don't worry," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. "You're not going crazy. What you felt was a gentle tap of infinity."
As time went by, I was able to corroborate what Don Juan had said about his two teachers. Don Juan Matus was exactly as he had described those two men to be. I would go as far as saying that he was an extraordinary blend of both of them. On the one hand, extremely quiet and introspective. On the other, extremely open and funny. The most accurate statement about what a Nagual is, which he voiced the day I found him, was that a Nagual is empty, and that emptiness doesn't reflect the world, but reflects infinity. Nothing could have been more true than this in reference to Don Juan Matus. His emptiness reflected infinity. There was no boisterousness on his part or assertions about the self. There was not a speck of a need to have other grievances or remorse. His was the emptiness of a warrior traveler, seasoned to the point where he doesn't take anything for granted. A warrior traveler who doesn't underestimate or overestimate anything. A quiet, disciplined fighter whose elegance is so extreme that no one, no matter how hard they try to look, will ever find the scene where all that complexity has come together. The end of an era. The deep concerns of everyday life. I went to Sonora to see Don Juan. I had to discuss with him the most serious event of that moment in my life. I needed his advice. When I arrived at his house, I barely went through the formality of greeting him. I sat down and blurted out my turmoil.
Calm down, Don Juan said. "Nothing can be that bad."
"What's happening to me, Don Juan?" I asked. It was a rhetorical question on my part.
"It is the workings of infinity," he replied. "Something happened to your way of perceiving the day you met me. Your sensation of nervousness is due to the subliminal realization that your time is up. You're aware of it, but not deliberately conscious of it. You feel the absence of time, and that makes you impatient. I know this, for it happened to me and to all these sorcerers of my lineage. At a given time, a whole era in my life, or their lives, ended. Now, it's your turn. You have simply run out of time."
He demanded then a total account of whatever had happened to me. He said that it had to be a full account, sparing no detail. He wasn't after sketchy descriptions. He wanted me to air the full impact of what was troubling me.
"Let's have this talk, as they say in your world, by the book," he said. "Let us enter into the realm of formal talks."
Don Juan explained that the shamans of ancient Mexico had developed the idea of formal versus informal talks, and used both of them as devices for teaching and guiding their disciples. Formal talks were, for them, summations that they made from time to time of everything they had taught or said to their disciples. Informal talks were daily elucidations in which things were explained without reference to anything but the phenomenon itself under scrutiny.
"Sorcerers keep nothing to themselves," he continued. "To empty themselves in this fashion is the sorcerer's maneuver. It leads them to abandon the fortress of the self."
I began my story, telling Don Juan that the circumstances of my life have never permitted me to be introspective. As far back in my past as I can remember, my daily life has been filled to the brim with pragmatic problems that have clamored for immediate resolution. I remember my favorite uncle telling me that he was appalled at having found out that I had never received a gift for Christmas or for my birthday. I'd come to live in my father's family's home not too long before he made that statement. He commiserated with me about the unfairness of my situation. He even apologized, although it had nothing to do with him. "It's disgusting, my boy," he said, shaking. "I want you to know that I am behind you 100% whenever the moment comes to redress wrongdoings." He insisted over and over that I had to forgive the people who had wronged me. From what he said, I formed the impression that he wanted me to confront my father with his finding and accuse him of indolence and neglect, and then, of course, forgive him. He failed to see that I didn't feel wronged at all. What he was asking me to do required an introspective nature that would make me respond to the barbs of psychological mistreatment once they were pointed out to me. I assured my uncle that I was going to think about it, but not at the moment, because at that very instant, my girlfriend, from the living room where she was waiting for me, was signaling me desperately to hurry up. I never had the opportunity to think about it, but my uncle must have talked to my father, because I got a gift from him. A package, neatly wrapped up with ribbon and all, and a little card that said, "Sorry." I curiously and eagerly ripped the wrappings. There was a cardboard box, and inside it, there was a beautiful toy, a tiny boat with a winding key attached to the steam pipe. It could be used by children to play with while they took baths in the bathtub. My father had thoroughly forgotten that I was already 15 years old, and for all practical purposes, a man. Since I'd reached my adult years, still incapable of serious introspection, it was quite a novelty when one day, years later, I found myself in the throes of a strange emotional agitation, which seemed to increase as time went by. I discarded it, attributing it to natural processes of the mind or the body that enter into action periodically, for no reason at all, or are perhaps triggered by biochemical processes within the body itself. I thought nothing of it. However, the agitation increased, and its pressure forced me to believe that I had arrived at a moment in life when what I needed was a drastic change. There was something in me that demanded a rearrangement of my life. This urge to rearrange everything was familiar. I had felt it in the past, but it had been dormant for a long time. I was committed to studying anthropology, and this commitment was so strong that not to study anthropology was never part of my proposed drastic change. It didn't occur to me to drop out of school and do something else. The first thing that came to mind was that I needed to change schools and go somewhere else, far away from Los Angeles. Before I undertook a change of that magnitude, I wanted to test the waters, so to speak. I enrolled in a full summer load of classes at a school in another city. The most important course for me was a class in anthropology taught by a foremost authority on the Indians of the Andean region. It was my belief that if I focused my studies on an area that was emotionally accessible to me, I would have a better opportunity to do anthropological fieldwork in a serious manner when the time came. I conceived of my knowledge of South America as giving me a better entree into any given Indian society. At the same time that I registered for school, I got a job as a research assistant to a psychiatrist who was the older brother of one of my friends. He wanted to do a content analysis of excerpts from some innocuous tapes of question and answer sessions with young men and women about their problems arising from overwork in school, unfulfilled expectations, not being understood at home, frustrating love affairs, etc. The tapes were over 5 years old and were going to be destroyed. But before they were, random numbers were allotted to each reel, and following a table of random numbers, reels were picked by the psychiatrist and his research assistants and scanned for excerpts that could be analyzed. On the first day of class in the new school, the anthropology professor talked about his academic bona fides, dazzled his students with the scope of his knowledge and his publication. He was a tall, slender man in his mid-40s with shifty blue eyes. What struck me the most about his physical appearance is that his eyes were rendered enormous behind glasses for correcting farsightedness, and each of his eyes gave the impression that it was rotating in an opposite direction from the other when he moved his head as he spoke. I knew that that couldn't be true. It was, however, a very disconcerting image. He was extremely well dressed for an anthropologist, who in my day were famous for their super casual attire. Archaeologists, for example, were described by their students as creatures lost in a carbon-14 dating who never took a bath. However, for reasons unbeknownst to me, what really set him apart wasn't his physical appearance or his erudition, but his speech pattern. He pronounced every word as clearly as anyone I had ever heard, and emphasized certain words by elongating. He had a markedly foreign intonation, but I knew that it was an affectation. He pronounced certain phrases like an Englishman and others like a revivalist preacher. He fascinated me from the start, despite his enormous pomposity. His self-importance was so blatant that it ceased to be an issue after the first 5 minutes of class, which were always bombastic displays of knowledge, cushioned in wild assertions about himself. His command of the audience was sensational. None of the students I talked to felt anything but supreme admiration for this extraordinary man. I earnestly thought that everything was moving along nicely and that this move to another school in another city was going to be easy and uneventful, but thoroughly positive. I liked my new surroundings. At my job, I became completely engrossed in listening to the tapes, to the point where I would sneak into the office and listen not to excerpts, but to entire tapes. What fascinated me beyond measure at first was the fact that I heard myself speaking in every one of those tapes. As the weeks went by and I heard more tapes, my fascination turned to sheer horror. Every line that was spoken, including the psychiatrist's question, was mine. Those people were speaking from the depths of my own being. The revulsion that I experienced was something unique for me. Never had I known that I could be repeated endlessly in every man or woman I heard speaking on the tape. My sense of individuality, which had been ingrained in me from birth, tumbled down hopelessly under the impact of this colossal discovery. I began then an odious process of trying to restore myself. I unconsciously made a ludicrous attempt at introspection. I tried to wriggle out of my predicament by endlessly talking to myself. I rehashed in my mind all the possible rationales that would support my sense of uniqueness, and then talked out loud to myself about it. I even experienced something quite revolutionary to me, waking myself up many times by my loud talking in my sleep, discoursing about my value and distinctiveness. Then, one horrifying day, I suffered another deadly blow. In the wee hours of the night, I was woken up by an insistent knocking on my door. It wasn't a mild, timid knock, but what my friends called a Gestapo knock. The door was about to come off its hinges. I jumped out of bed and opened it peephole. The person who was knocking on the door was my boss, the psychiatrist. My being his younger brother's friend seemed to have created an avenue of communication. He had befriended me without any hesitation, and there he was, on my doorstep. I turned on the light and opened the door. "Please, come in," I said. "What happened?" It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and by his livid expression and his sunken eyes, I knew that he was deeply upset. He came in and sat down. His pride and joy, his black mane of longish hair, was falling all over his face. He didn't make any effort to comb his hair back the way he usually wore it. I liked him very much because he was an older version of my friend in Los Angeles, with black, heavy eyebrows, penetrating brown eyes, a square jaw, and thick lips. His upper lip seemed to have an extra fold inside, which at times, when he smiled in a certain way, gave the impression that he had a double upper lip. He always talked about the shape of his nose, which he described as an impertinent, pushy nose. I thought he was extremely sure of himself and opinionated beyond belief. He claimed that in his profession, those qualities were winning cards. "What happened?" he repeated with a tone of mockery, his double upper lip trembling uncontrollably. "Anyone can tell that everything has happened to me tonight." He sat down in a chair. He seemed dizzy, disoriented, looking for words. He got up and went to the couch, slumping down on it. "It's not only that I have the responsibility of my patients," he went on, "but my research grant, my wife and kids, and now another fucking pressure has been added to it, and what burns me up is that it was my own fault, my own stupidity for putting my trust in a stupid cunt. I'll tell you, Carlos," he continued, "there's nothing more appalling, disgusting, fucking nauseating than the insensitivity of women. I'm not a woman hater, you know that. But at this moment, it seems to me that every single cunt is just a cunt. Duplicitous and vile." I didn't know what to say. Whatever he was telling me didn't need affirmation or contradiction. I wouldn't have dared to contradict him anyway. I didn't have the ammunition for it. I was very tired. I wanted to go back to sleep. But he kept on talking, as if his life depended on it. "You know Teresa Manning, don't you?" he asked me in a forceful, accusatory manner. For an instant, I believed that he was accusing me of having something to do with his young, beautiful student secretary. Without giving me time to respond, he continued talking. "Teresa Manning is an asshole. She's a schnook, a stupid, inconsiderate woman who has no incentive in life other than bawling anyone with a bit of fame and notoriety. I thought she was intelligent and sensitive. I thought she had something, some understanding, some empathy, something that one would like to share or hold as precious all to oneself. I don't know, but that's the picture that she painted for me. When, in reality, she's lewd and degenerate, and, I may add, incurably gross." As he kept on talking, a strange picture began to emerge. Apparently, the psychiatrist had just had a bad experience involving his secretary. "Since the day she came to work for me," he went on, "I knew that she was attracted to me sexually. She never came around to saying it. It was all in the innuendos and the looks. But fuck it. This afternoon, I got sick and tired of pussyfooting around, and I came right to the point. I went up to her desk and said, 'I know what you want, and you know what I want.'" He went into a great elaborate rendition of how forcefully he had told her that he expected her in his apartment across the street from the school at 11:30 p.m., and that he did not alter his routines for anybody, that he read and worked and drank wine until 1 o'clock, at which time he retired to the bedroom. He kept an apartment in town, as well as the house he and his wife and children lived in the suburb. "I was so confident that the affair was going to pan out, turn into something memorable," he said, and sighed. His voice acquired the mellow tone of someone confiding something intimate. "I even gave her the key to my apartment," he said, and his voice cracked. "Very dutifully, she came at 11:30, he went on. "She let herself in with her own key and sneaked into the bedroom, like a shadow. That excited me terribly. I knew that she wasn't going to be any trouble for me. She knew her role. She probably fell asleep on the bed, or maybe she watched TV. I became engrossed in my work, and I didn't care what the fuck she did. I knew that I had her in the bag. But the moment I came into the bedroom," he continued, his voice tense and constricted as if he were morally offended. "Teresa jumped on me like an animal and went for my dick. She didn't even give me time to put down the bottle and the 2 glasses I was carrying. I had enough presence of mind to put my 2 Baccarat glasses on the floor without breaking them. The bottle flew across the room when she grabbed my balls as if they were made out of rocks. I wanted to hit her. I actually yelled in pain, but that didn't faze her.